So you were elected 2 terms in a predominantly blue state. How did Larry Hogan do it? I mean, this is a Dem state. The only Republican to do that was in the 1950s. How did you pull that off?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. I'm not quite sure, other than, I think we had a message that resonated with people regardless of their party affiliation. And so this is actually the bluest state in America, and I'm only the second Republican to be reelected in 242 years in the entire history of the state. So we had to do something right, but I think a lot of it was the issues we focused on, and that I wasn't overly partisan. That a lot of people said, I've never voted for a Republican in my life, but I voted for you because you seem to care about the state. And I think they thought I was down to earth, and I told it like it was. That there wasn't a lot of spin, and it seemed to resonate not just with Republican voters, but with Democrats and independents who just said, I don't care what the person's party is. I just want somebody that's focused on fixing the problems and that's willing to work together.
Did you ever feel pressure from Republicans, the hard righters, to go more toward the right, and how did you deal with that?
Well, sure. I mean, there were a lot of people on the right that would like to drag me more to the right, but I just stayed true to who I was, and I never really made any decisions based on politics. That sounds strange, but I'm a lifelong businessman, never held elective office. Being governor is the first one of these jobs I've had, and I just try to do the right thing and make the tough decisions. And they would say, well, that's going to upset this group or that group. And I just made the decisions I thought were right, and I let the politics fall where it may. But it turns out 74% of the people in the state approved of the job we're doing. So the critics on both sides, on the left or the right, I don't pay much attention.
What's fascinating about your governorship is that you won against 2 African Americans to win office and be reelected in a state that has a lot of African American voters, and as we talked about, is a blue state. How did you win over these African American voters? What was the sauce, the secret sauce for you?
Well, yeah, it's one of the things I'm actually proud of. Not that I beat those 2, fine gentlemen, but that black voters actually trusted me and thought that I cared about them and that I would work for them. So it just happened to be that those 2 candidates were black, but Maryland has the highest, we're a majority minority state, one of the only ones in the country, and we have the highest black population outside of the South. And I ran against the national president of the NAACP for re-election when only one other Republican in history had ever been re-elected, and I won 30% of the black vote, which no Republican ever gets. And it said to me that people thought I was a straight shooter, that I cared about the black community, and that I was working on issues they cared about. I was trying to be focused on crime and on improving the schools. I came in during the riots in Baltimore when some people said, oh, that was going to make the situation worse. But I walked the streets and worked with community leaders and faith leaders and NAACP. We stopped the violence immediately, but we kept the neighborhoods safe, but we allowed for peaceful protests. And I think people gave me the credit for that. They said, I have people every day come up to me and say, I'm a lifelong Democrat. They're black voters and say, you're the only one I've ever voted for, but I appreciate you. And they'll say, I don't even agree with you on everything, but I know that you're telling the truth when you say something. And that means a lot. I think that.
Yeah, how does that make you feel?
It makes me feel great because, I think black voters particularly rewarded me for they don't like a lot of BS. And they were like, even though that guy's a Republican, I like the fact that he just answers the question.
Let's talk about your accomplishments. The biggest accomplishment or accomplishments you've had since being in office, as well as failures, disappointments. Talk first about your accomplishments.
The biggest accomplishment, I only ran for governor because I was a small business guy that was really frustrated about what was happening to our state. We were kind of way off track, heading in the wrong direction. They had raised taxes 43 times in a row. It cost us 8,000 businesses and almost 200,000 jobs left. There was a Gallup poll that came out that said 48% of all Marylanders want to leave the state, which really broke my heart as a lifelong Marylander. I ran not talking about all kinds of issues, just talking about, I want to make Maryland more competitive. I want to stop these tax increases. I want to help small businesses grow. I want to put people back to work. I'm going to turn the economy around. That's what I ran for. That's what I focused on. And our success has been amazing. So we haven't had a single tax increase in 8 years. We cut taxes 8 years in a row by $4.7 billion. I inherited a $5 billion deficit. I turned it into a $5 billion surplus, biggest one in history. We've got more businesses open, more people working than ever before in the history of the state. And we took our overall economic performance from 49th out of 50 states to number 6, which is the biggest economic turnaround in America. So that's the thing I'm most proud of. We accomplished a lot, but that's the one I came here to do. And it doesn't happen very often in politics, but we just did exactly what we said we were going to do.
Your biggest disappointment? Something that you left on the table?
The biggest disappointment is that we weren't able to do more to make our local school systems more accountable, to do something about fixing persistently failing schools. We have some of the best schools in America, and we're some of the highest funded schools in America, but we have persistently failing schools. And I believe very strongly that every single person in our state and in the country deserves access to a world-class education, regardless of what neighborhood they happen to grow up in. But I was constantly trying to, make them more transparent, more accountable, to try to make sure that the dollars were getting into the classrooms where it was going to make a difference in kids' lives and give them more opportunity. And that's one we weren't successful in, going up against the teachers union and fighting against the entrenched interests in, say, Baltimore City school system, or where they weren't willing to make changes, and we still have kids that are getting cheated. And then the second one would be crime. We invested more in public safety than any other administration in history, but Baltimore City's got more than 300 murders a year, and we passed criminal justice reform. We're the first and best in the country, but we couldn't get the violent criminals off the streets of Baltimore, and I think hopefully it'll see some differences. We have a new state's attorney, a new U.S. attorney, and I've been through 4 mayors and 5 police commissioners, and it's still a problem. People are afraid in their own neighborhoods.
Yeah. Let's get back to education for just a quick second here. So you talked about the teachers union being entrenched, but is it deeper than that? Is it more a parental issue as well? And what would be your antidote to address it?
I think we need to we need to find a way to make sure every kid is getting the best education. There certainly are problems if kids don't have parents at home that are making sure they're doing the homework. That makes it difficult, or people are in the circumstances they grew up in makes a difference. But our school systems can and should do a better job of doing everything we can to giving those kids the opportunities that they deserve.
Right. Let's go to early in your first term. You were diagnosed with the word that a lot of us don't want to hear. I know I've lost both my parents to cancer and
I'm sorry.
So I understand it all too well, more than most. Recall that moment in your life and how it hit you, how it impacted you. Did you think about, God, am I going to have to resign or take a leave of absence? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it kind of hit me from out of the blue. I came in, we had riots in Baltimore after 89 days after being governor, and then about 60 days later, I got hit with this personal challenge from out of the blue, where I didn't have any idea that I was sick, but I was diagnosed with really advanced and aggressive cancer that had spread all over my body. I had 40 or 50 tumors, and the prognosis wasn't that great, and the treatment was pretty aggressive. I had to do off and on 6 months of 24-hour-a-day chemotherapy in the hospital. And it was rough. I used to have a beautiful head of hair, and
I saw that.
but I just kept working like anybody else who goes through that and has to continue to try to do their job. And I had a very supportive and loving family, and I'm a believer in the power of prayer. I had people all over the state and the world praying for me. I had a great team backing me up. The lieutenant governor and our staff was great. And I actually ran to stay from the hospital bed for, many months. I was very transparent. I told the people of Maryland, I got diagnosed on Friday of Father's Day weekend, and I was stunned. I didn't know, like anybody else that gets that. And my first thought was, how do I tell my wife and my 3 daughters? And my dad, who was elderly but was still around and was there for Father's Day weekend. And then I said, how am I going to tell the people of Maryland? Which I did on Monday at a press conference. But it was a tremendous personal challenge, but I met so many incredible people that were going through much tougher battles than my own. I met their families that were, supporting them, and it made me more empathetic and made me understand what people go through, and it made me tougher and made me realize the things that are important in life. And it made me a believer in doing what we can to fight cancer. And so we launched a Cancer Moonshot Initiative. We're building a new cancer center in Prince George's County. In Largo, we're building a new one in Baltimore, and we're going to do everything we can to kind of stamp out these terrible diseases.
What kind of cancer was it?
I had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So it's cancer of the immune system, a blood cancer. It would spread all over my lymph nodes everywhere. So it was a tough one. But I had great doctors at the University of Maryland Medical Center and a great team of people supporting me. And I appreciate the fact that kind of Marylanders rallied behind me.
Yeah. And I appreciate you talking about that. The state of, let's switch a little bit to the rest of the state. The state of Maryland is a very, as you know, diverse state from the Eastern Shore to Western Maryland. Talk a little bit about sort of the formula that you were able to reach as a moderate Republican, these different areas. As we talked about with African Americans, you're able to win them over with, being a straight shooter. But how did you win over those deep red areas of the state as well?
Well, I did when my first election, I won, 85, 90% of the vote in those areas. So, those were Republican strongholds and not a lot of population. But, I did just as well among conservative Republicans as, say, Donald Trump did. I just happened to add to that by winning suburban women and winning Asians and Hispanics and winning 30-some% of the black vote, which Republicans don't normally do. But in those areas, I promised, I thought they had kind of felt like they were being ignored and forgotten, and I promised them that they weren't going to be neglected, that we were going to pay more attention to people in some of the more rural areas in southern Maryland and western Maryland, Eastern Shore. And we've also delivered on those promises, and I think they feel like we've done a good job. So we delivered for them. But, those were the areas that a Republican should do well. It was when I showed up in Inner Beltway, Prince George's County, or I showed up in West Baltimore, and people were surprised. Like, why is this Republican guy campaigning here? Like, we're Democrats. But they saw me. I kept showing up, and I kept listening, and I kept trying to work and help, and that way we earned some street cred, I think.
And you broke the mold in a way.
Yeah, well, I think it's important. I mean, I really believe if my party is to ever be successful in the future, we have to have a message that appeals to more people, and we can't be shrinking the tent. We got to grow to a more inclusive party.
Is that a message, and we're going to get to some of that a little bit in the interview, but is that a message that your party wants to really hear?
I don't know whether they want to or not, but they're going to keep hearing it from me, and that's what I've been saying for the whole 8 years I've been governor, and I've been probably the strongest voice over the past 6 years. And since the last election, I mean, I went in November of 20 after Trump lost to Joe Biden. I spoke at the Reagan Library, Reagan Institute, and I said it's time for choosing, which was a Reagan speech. But I said we have to decide if we're going to continue to, head down this road, or we're going to get back to a, more traditional Republican Party. It's still a battle for the heart and soul of my party, and I'm going to continue to, in one way or another, be a part of that battle because I think it's important. I'm a big believer in a competitive two-party system is important for our democracy.
Let's talk about your father. You mentioned him a little earlier about not wanting to tell him about your cancer diagnosis, but he was in public service from what I understand. What did you learn from him the most? What message did you take into this job? Because like you said, you were new to politics. And did he encourage you to go into public service? Was that sort of what he saw for you?
Well, I learned an awful lot about integrity and public service from my dad, and I'm very proud to be his son. I wasn't a stranger to politics because my dad ran for with Congress. I was a kid, and I followed it. I knew about campaigns, and I just spent my life in business, and I never held elective office before. But I wasn't a stranger. I kind of knew how it worked, and I knew why it was important, and so I was always sort of involved. My dad gave me good advice early on. He said, public service is important, but you have to have some other career. You shouldn't be, he didn't believe in professional politicians who spend their entire, careers in office, that you should go do something and then go, represent. And that's, so I spent, decades in the private sector and only kind of got into public office when I felt like I had to, when I said, somebody's got to do something about this, and nobody else was stepping up. But yeah, my dad was on the House Judiciary Committee during the impeachment of Richard Nixon. He was the first Republican to come out and call for Nixon's impeachment and the only Republican to vote for all 3 articles. And, it made him a lot of enemies in the Republican Party at the time. But all these years later, it's what he's most finally remembered for. And it was his really shining moment, something I was proud of him for.
And does that teach you to be bold as you look possibly to the future? We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but does that teach you to be bold about who you are and your convictions?
Well, what it taught me, my dad, I saw him make the decision. I was in high school at the time, and I saw he knew it was bad for his career. he knew he was going to have people really angry with him in his own party, but he thought it was the right thing to do for the country. So I think putting country ahead of party or ahead of your own self-interest was a huge, valuable lesson I learned from him. And I think I have carried forward some of that in all of my decision making. I'm just going to do whatever I think is right and not worry about, the politics of it. And I think I think we need more of that in politics today in both parties.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your wife, your lovely wife, and sort of talk a little bit about how she was a support system for you during the cancer diagnosis and then after as governor. This is a very busy job. You work a lot of hours. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, my wife's been a tremendous, she's a wonderful wife and mother, but she's also been a great first lady and a huge support system for me. When I went through the cancer thing, that's a really hard thing. I mean, when people go through that battle, and she was there nearly every day in the hospital. She was praying for me. She was doing all the things that I couldn't do. She was filling in for me. She and the lieutenant governor were both out, handling all the events that I couldn't go to because I was stuck in the hospital, getting chemo, and I couldn't be around people because my immune system was compromised. So she stepped up. I mean, she's not a politician, didn't want to do that. English is a second language for her, but she went out and did it. And she's been very supportive. I think, she's been a tremendous first lady, and I wouldn't have gotten elected without her, and I wouldn't have been as successful without her. And I think it also helped me with talking about, why I did well among minority voters. I mean, we won the Asian vote. A lot of people said, well, this guy doesn't look like a typical Republican family. I'm the only white guy in my family, and we've got the first diverse family living in the governor's mansion, and she was a big part of our success.
That's awesome. It is widely believed that you will run for president. I know that you've had your national footprint out there. Where is your head at right now regarding this? I mean, we're in the exploratory committee stage. You got to announce at some point, raise money. Where's your head at now? And do you have a kitchen cabinet together that you feel as though, a team that if you're going to do this, you can bring forward to push?
It's a great question. I've never said I was going to run, but there's certainly people have been talking about this. It's at least, 2020 that encouraging me to consider running. And I am one of the most successful governors in America with one of the highest job approvals, and we've done a lot in a very difficult place. So I understand that I'm flattered by the fact that people are talking like that. I never imagined in my wildest dreams people would be mentioning me as a possible president.
You never imagined that in your wildest dreams?
Never once imagined it. That was never something I focused on. But it's flattering. It's humbling. But I haven't made that decision. I didn't rule it out because, if I thought when I ran for governor, I thought I have to do this, because no one else is going to do it. If I thought that I could make that difference, then that might be a decision I made. But I could easily go back to the private sector, or I could say I'm going to be a voice. I'm going to be a part of the discussion about getting the party on track, but I don't have to necessarily be the candidate. So I promised I was going to finish my day job as governor. I'm winding up that, in a week and a half or so, but after that, I'm going to take it easy. My wife said I have to take a vacation. It'll be the first one in 4 years. It'll be the second one in 8 years.
Where are you going?
We're going to go somewhere warm and sit under a palm tree.
To be decided.
Veg out, and then I'll talk to certainly we have a kitchen cabinet. We have a great staff and team and political advisors. We've won some of the toughest races in the country, and I formed a group called an America United, which is a C4 that's been talking about trying to, improve the politics in America. And I recently, in November, launched a PAC called A Better Path Forward. I think we've shown a better path forward in Maryland. And so, it's not like I'm not telling you the decision. I really haven't made the decision, but it's something that we'll certainly give some consideration to.
Why would you want to be president?
Well, I would only want to be president if I thought it was important for the country and that I could make a difference. And, I don't need the ego gratification. Be perfectly content with leaving, as the most successful governor in our state history, or being one of the top governors in the country and saying I did a good job. And, but I would do it if I thought that it was something that I had to do for the country.
How many candidates do you expect to run? I know former president.
So far, there's only one.
Former president.
There's one candidate. Donald Trump says he's going to run, although that was a couple months ago. I haven't seen any campaign at all. There are 20-some other people, being talked about in both parties. I don't know if President Biden is going to run. I don't know if President Trump's going to run, and I don't know who else might run. I think we've never seen a time where nobody really has any idea who the Republican or Democratic nominee is going to be.
Would that influence your jumping into the race if, say, President Biden decides to step aside, as some Democrats are pushing him to do?
I don't know that would impact me at all. I'm going to make a decision on what's, I think, the right path for me and whether I think I can make a difference. It's hard to imagine that a sitting president doesn't run for re-election, and I have no idea who the other Democrats might be, but it would certainly change the dynamic.
Other than yourself, are there any front runners that you would consider in the Republican side?
There's a lot of folks that I have respect for, and a lot of them are some of the ones that are being mentioned out there. But I would get in the race if I thought I was the best one. But that doesn't mean I don't have respect for some of the other folks that they're talking about.
On former President Trump, do you think perhaps that maybe, he's facing a litany of charges. Do you think he gets indicted this year?
I don't want to speculate. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know enough about the evidence to make that kind of a decision. But it's certainly having difficult times, and I think a lot of people, even who supported President Trump's policies and voted for him, are starting to lose patience, and he's starting to lose support. And people are like saying, I supported him, but enough is enough, and maybe it's time to look in a different direction.
Governor-elect Wes Moore will be Maryland's 63rd governor. How are you feeling about his future governorship and him? I know you had high praise downstairs. I covered that press conference. I asked you one of those questions, in fact. How do you feel about him coming in?
Well, I'm very excited for him. I watch this new incoming administration. I think back to 8 years ago when we came in. Both of us had never held elective office. We're different parties and different races and different age, generations and all that. But one thing we share is we came into this job, and I know what he's about to be faced with, and we left things in a lot better shape for him. I inherited a mess. We're leaving the shape in the best shape it's ever been. So I want that to continue. So I want him to be a success. I want Maryland to keep heading in the right direction. We've done everything to cooperate with him in the transition. I spent, prior to me coming down where you were covering that press conference down at the bottom of the steps here, I spent about an hour and a half meeting with him one-on-one. Our teams have been working together for months. I had he and his wife and kids over to the governor's mansion for another hour and a half where we showed him where he's going to be living and answered all the questions and walked him through a tour. And he seemed like a very nice family. He's a smart guy and affable, likable guy. We're different parties. My concern is I don't want to see things go back to, people like the fact that we had balance, and what they didn't like, and the reason I got elected in 2014 was a monopoly that everybody moved a little too far to the left. And that was my advice to him, and I'm hoping that they should act like we're still balanced rather than taking it off.
Do you expect him to be more moderate when he comes into office?
I hope so. I think that's what most of the voters want. 3/4 of the people in Maryland like the way the direction we're heading now, and I wouldn't want to reverse all of that because it probably wouldn't be that popular.
If you had to predict, last question, what kind of governor will he be? How would you predict it based on what you know now? Because he's, like you said, he's in a similar position.
He's got a lot of skills. He's a smart guy, and I wish him the best. But I don't want to make predictions about how he's going to be. We're going to let the voters decide that after he gets in the job.
Great.
Let me throw one question in here, Governor. A message that you'd like to say to the citizens of Maryland.
Yeah, I just want to thank the people of Maryland for giving me the incredible opportunity to serve. It's been the greatest job of my life. I think we did the best we could. I think we're leaving the state in a better shape than we found it, and I just want to thank people for giving me this honor. It's been an amazing 8 years.